Hey everyone, this is the first recording for the Bible cohort, where we're going to explore the story of the Bible together. So let me introduce the folks who will be doing it along with you. I've got Meredith here.
Hi.
Scott is here as well.
Hello.
And Matt.
Hey.
And so we are going to begin, we'll start at the beginning with the book of Genesis.
Good place to start.
It's a good place to start, and Genesis means beginnings.
That's great. Well named.
That's why it's a good place to start.
Off to a great start.
Good
job.
Yeah, welcome to our podcast, everyone. So here's what we're going to do. In most of these recordings, I'll start off with a brief snapshot of the book. As you're reading through it or sections of it, who knows where you're at exactly, but you'll be able to understand a bit more of the whole. And then we'll dive into talking about what it's like to read it and what stands out to us, and be with you in the journey of learning more about the story of the Bible together. So Genesis is the first book of the Bible, and it covers a lot of stuff. It covers the creation of the universe. It covers the fall of man into sin, and it covers God's promise to redeem his creation using this one guy, Abraham. And from there, you get a lot of stories of Abraham's family, and that kind of tells you about the book as a whole. It's a lot of stories. Genre-wise, they call it narrative. So what you have in Genesis are historical stories of the major events of the world and the lives of these specific people. And in the major storyline of the Bible, it covers three of the big sections, or at least touches on three of them: creation, and then fall, and then the promise to Abraham of a kingdom. And it's structured kind of around those elements, so you see creation and fall happen in the first few chapters, and then the fall is explored further through, Noah, before him, Cain and Abel, and then the Tower of Babel in chapter 11. And then from chapter 12 onward, you have God making and fulfilling in a preliminary way these promises to Abraham about his descendants and how they'll make a great nation, and through them, God will bless all the nations. And then you get the biggest, kind of most detailed section after Abraham's son and then Abraham's grandson in his great-grandson, Joseph. A whole long section at the end of Genesis. But the whole thing, you put it together, is just God making a good world and human beings falling into sin, and God beginning to fulfill his promise to redeem things through this particular man and the descendants that will come from him. And that's the overview of the book of Genesis. So let's talk about it. What's it like to read the book of Genesis?
I mean, this book has so many of the stories that if you grew up in the church, we read in Sunday school, and it almost feels like visiting, a park from your childhood. If I'm a lifer Christian. So for me, it's like revisiting this childhood park. There's things that are familiar and nostalgic and beautiful, and then there's new things that I discover reading it through just from the perspective I'm coming from at the age I'm at in this moment. And there's parts of it that are grittier than I remember and more complicated than I remember, but it definitely, there's a lot of names, a lot of people, and a lot of twists and turns. So it's pretty engaging, I find.
Yeah, that's been my experience. I feel like it's reading a great adventure book.
Mm.
Now, the genre might throw you off a little bit, right? Because I think it's not a page turner the way that maybe a modern novel stories get told. And so I think sometimes we can get bogged down in the details, but all it takes is a small step back to engage your imagination and think through, wait, what's actually taking place here? Right? How did these people feel in the midst of this? What does that mean for them, for their family, for their descendants? What would it be like to hear God that way, or to experience that kind of suffering? And all of a sudden you're into pretty quickly the twists and the turns and the joys and the devastations and the hopes and the dreams and the tragedies that are just, it's this incredible, exciting, fascinating story of humanity, of the beginning of humanity, and specifically of the beginning of God's people, the people of Abraham.
Yeah, I think I think that all of those things are true. I find it maybe one of the fascinating things about it is it can be very confusing because of how distant culturally and like life it is. Like you read through it and you're kind of like, what are these why are these people responding this way? Like, why are they acting like this? What is the situation here? Or you might read something that maybe sounds very normal to you, like the call of Abram is he's told to leave this land that is his home and go to a new land. And we're like, oh yeah, like you move in LA from
like you leave Cincinnati.
Yeah, you go to the Midwest,
Off
or
to college.
You move to the suburbs, or whatever it is, right? Like there's like movement is such a familiar thing for us. And I think it takes a little bit of time, maybe a little time and effort to put myself as I'm reading through it as into such a different world that is so foreign. But then there's also so much of it that's so familiar too. Like some of the hurt and the suffering, the uncertainty, the anxiety, the hope, like the joy that comes from the hope that is given in promise. All of those things are, I think, wrapped up together in something that's distant and feels distant and foreign, but also fundamentally human in a way that is really, really helpful for me as a foreground for everything else that comes in the history of God's world.
Yeah, it is kind of jarring in ways, isn't it? Like you start with like this cosmic, creation. There's a talking snake, and then like a few chapters later, this guy's murdering his brother. And then a few chapters later, some guy sends his servant to find his son a wife, like by who waters a camel at a well. And
you don't always know why.
Yeah.
Why? Why did we do that?
Yeah, why then there's not always explanation.
Yeah. It is.
It's just like,
There's
this is how it
usually
is.
that explanation.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's one of the interesting things about Genesis in particular is you have this worldwide scope in the beginning that over about 11 chapters, like you hit chapter 12 and it really narrows down to this one man and then his one son and then his son and then his 12 sons. And that story takes up most of Genesis. And so if you're thinking about this cosmic idea of God creating the world and the fall of humanity into sin, it can be a little hard to piece all those stories together until you realize that it's because of the fall that God is actually going to try and redeem the world, and he's going to do it through this promise he makes to this one man and his lineage.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that's really interesting is while it narrows specifically, God's focus on his cosmic focus, right? His focus on the entire world, on all the nations, is repeated over and over and over again, right? It's repeated in the call to Abraham that he wants to bless him so that he be a blessing, so his glory might be known among all the nations. And that focus on the blessing and the care and the redemption of the nations, even in Joseph's, the provision of Joseph for the good of Egypt, not just for the good of Israel, is a fascinating theme that it can feel like, maybe on the surface, that it gets more and more and more narrow, but that the beginning, this cosmic perspective that Genesis begins with, it's fascinating to see it pop up and carried through actually the entire book.
Yeah, I think that's the main story. That it's helpful to orient yourself when you read. That this really is one story. You mentioned, Meredith, like visiting a playground from when you were young. I think a lot of people know a lot of the stories in the Bible, but they don't necessarily know like the story of the Bible. And so the fact that all of Genesis, and we're going to see this as we go through the Bible cohort, all of the Bible is actually connected. It's all part of one grand storyline, becomes really helpful as you read, because one chapter a day, or whatever your particular reading plan is in your Christian life, might not. You might lose sight of that grand story in the slowness of things.
Yeah, if you have the chance to read the whole thing, really kind of not in one setting, but like in a chunk like this, you see a lot of the repetition that you're talking about, Scott. The fact that the blessing and the promise, it comes back chapter after chapter. It's repeated and reiterated, and it continues to draw our focus to why we're following this family, what God is doing in their lives, and what his big picture plan is.
And I think what's beautiful about that is you can have that meta narrative, for using the big term. You can have that sort of big picture storyline, but that doesn't prevent you from getting into like the details of the actual story as it's presented to us in the actual book of the Bible. Like you can get into the details of all of the ins and outs of Joseph's life and the intrigue and all of these other things, and yet it's it's that connection to a higher story that makes both aspects of the story, I think, tell a comprehensive whole in a beautiful way.
Yeah, so there's Genesis in a nutshell. Like it really is the story of the creation and the fall, and then God's beginning to redeem the world using this man Abraham, and then his son and his son and his great grandson, in this way that all those stories are caught up in that grand idea. That being said, what's one part of this book or one element of this book that stood out to you as you read it? Something you want to call out?
Who gets to take what? You get to
I think Meredith gets to call dibs.
Oh, you guys are fantastic.
Where are you going to start? All right.
I was really struck by the size of Abraham's clan. Like that, I think because so many of these stories are really interpersonal, sometimes we can overlay our own family perspective on, this is just a story between a husband and a wife. But Abraham, at one point, he takes an army of 300 trained men.
He's rolling deep.
So if there's that many men, there's all the wives and children. I mean, it's a large, I guess small, I don't know. It's a little bit of a village. And that adds color to the complexity of the relationship between he and Sarah. When he's looking for a wife for his son, she's not just a romantic partner. She's somebody who's going to come in and take this role of matriarch and help run the whole clan.
Yeah.
So, she has to be somebody who's hospitable and who understands how to get things done. So that to me really, really stood out this time around.
I mean, there's so much that stood out. I could talk for a long time about just the first 3 chapters, right? There's so much there. But maybe for me, the specific thing that stood out as I was just reflecting on it is the last fifth of the book, which is the story of Joseph. And it's really interesting to me that much of this story or that much of this book is dedicated to that story, to that character. Because when you think about Genesis, you're like Adam and Eve. Think about Genesis, you think Abraham, like maybe even Noah. But over a fifth of the book is dedicated to the life and travails of Joseph. And it struck me when it's a fifth of the book, like Job is 1/5 of the wisdom books. So if you're talking about wisdom books, like there's 5 of them. And Joseph is kind of like the Job of Genesis. Like it's the introduction to this idea of the fact that life in a fallen world really comes with deep suffering. And there's abuse and there's injustice. It's inside of the Joseph narrative that we get the story of Judah and Tamar, which is horrific. And there's so much horrific suffering. And it also has this very, very clear, almost so clear, it's like underlined and highlighted perspective of the presence of God, right? That God is present and he's good and he's powerful and he's working. And this whole story just over and over and over seems to highlight those same themes. And that has stuck out to me as something that for lots of reasons, God wanted to put first and foremost in our minds as he, in a sense, introduces himself to us in the first book of the Bible.
Yeah. And I guess the part that's left over, in many ways, Genesis is broken up. The first 11 chapters, Genesis 1 through 11, are kind of their own section of sorts before Abram's on the scene, right? So you're talking about Abram, you're talking about Joseph, and a lot of the focus of the story there goes to the people of God as descendants of Abram. But for me, I saw the first few chapters always speak so loud to me. Just thinking about creation, thinking about the introduction of sin into the world, thinking about the serpent undermining God's word, right? Like the first thing he says, did God really say, right? There's a sense in which so much of my experience, even as sin enters the world, the idea of blame shifting, and they're like, Adam says to God, the woman, the one that you gave to me, she's the one who gave me the fruit. Like there's one woman on earth. You don't need to specify which one, Adam, right? There's like so much blame shift. There's so much that's relatable to the early chapters of sin entering the world and what sin still looks like to this day, the way that it confuses and distorts and undermines God's word, the way that it just explains so much of how the world is as it is now, our experience of the world. A lot of it begins there. And, I think about, in many ways, the Adam and Eve falling into sin in Genesis chapter 3 is sort of like one of the saddest parts of all of Scripture. It's where paradise is lost. It's where the brokenness and the suffering and the hurt and the injustice and the sin and all the evil of this world begins, like really there, right? And so there's this profound context there that I think is helpful, not just for the rest of the book of Genesis and not just for the rest of the Hebrew Old Testament, but for us in our own lives. And there's a hope in that too, because the end of times, we obviously aren't there yet, but in many ways recapitulates the beginning of times. The things at the end are kind of an undoing of the things that happen here at the beginning. And there's such a profound hope to that as we look forward to the new creation that is to come.
Yeah, I'm always captured by the Abraham, Sarah, Isaac part. Just the miracle, the promise and the faith required for someone who's that old to sort of go, yeah, okay. The taking into his own hands, the idea of like having an heir a different way in Ishmael, the care that God shows Hagar and Ishmael, despite sort of being like part of Abraham's sort of humanistic kind of plan, or human-based kind of plan to make things his own way. But then that drastic turn when, Isaac, who's named after laughter, after Abraham laughs and Sarah laughs, and there's such a beautiful human element to that, where they're laughing in a sense in disbelief, but they're also laughing in joy, and it's all at the same time. And I feel very, that resonates with me a lot, of like the experience of being a human in a fallen world where faith can be a burden as much as a joy, and just to see things turn in a way that your laugh in disbelief and incredulity turns into a laugh of joy, and who could have seen? It's beautiful. And then to turn that onto Mount Moriah, where it says, sacrifice your only son, your beloved son, and to watch that play out. Like
that gets harder to read every time.
Oh, geez. Well, once you're a parent, especially in some ways, like it's hard when you're not a parent, but like there's something about placing yourself in a scene that's easier when you have those similar circumstances.
Well, so many of the stories too, there's things that they're going through that as I get older, I'm like, oh my gosh, like these family dynamics are really painful, and it hits different,
Yeah. And that's something that, a first read, the Bible's built to be read like lots of times, and a first read, like most first reads, is meant to give you a sense of the story. And I think some of you listening are on, in a sense, your first read of the whole, of trying to get your arms around the story of things. And maybe you're jumping over chapters in the reading plan or things like that, but you're trying to get your arms around it. Here's what the story says. But as you come back around, you start to notice all the interconnections and all the dynamics that are at work that maybe a first read didn't show you. For example, Matt brought out the idea that there's a creation and a fall. That happens like 8 times in Genesis. And the more you pay it, after Noah, here's the same language of creation. Then there's a fall after that. It happens with Abraham. It happens like over and over again. Someone offers, Sarah offers Abraham this way out with Hagar and Ishmael, and he takes it and do it God's way. And you have all these repercussions from that. But even more than that, you things are set up in Genesis that as you read it through the lens of reality and history, you go, oh, that's going to complicate things. So when Jacob has these 2 wives and they both have kids, those kids are going to have a unique relationship to each other because one of their moms was more loved than the other. And you find that playing out in their relationships for the rest of the book. And so there's all this fascinating stuff that comes when you take what Meredith is saying and go, let me just think about this as a person and not sort of as like an outside observer who's learning things about the Bible, and you let it be the story that it is. You realize there's so much here that is not just relatable, but helps me understand what's going to come next.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that being said, we touched on some of this, but like, what from Genesis, what does it teach us today? Like, what lessons can we draw from Genesis? More than we can talk about, but what are some that you'd want to highlight?
Yeah, there's so many. But I think maybe in big swaths, one of the things that I feel like Genesis teaches us is why the world is as hard as it is. When we talk about the fall, we're not just talking about rebellion and sin. We're also talking about the effects of that in every area and arena of life. And And then this lesson is kind of twofold, but in part it explains the why of our hearts, right? Why do I bristle against God? Why do I want to do things my own way? Why isn't obeying just like simple, right? And it gives us a theological and really very personal category in understanding the sin and the choices and how our choices so consistently mirror Adam and Eve's. But not just that, it also shows us why the world's so broken, why suffering exists to such deep levels. And I think just meditating on that, considering that, it makes it not surprising anymore. I think sometimes we're surprised by suffering. Reading, first of all, understanding the fall makes us go, oh, okay, so we shouldn't be surprised. And then reading the narrative helps us see that in other people's real lives. You're like, oh, okay, so that's the norm. That kind of pain and difficulty and struggle is actually the norm in a fallen world. And maybe, and I want to elaborate on this because we could talk a lot, but maybe in the midst of that, we also learn that we're not left alone in it, right? That God has hope and redemption and promises in it. It makes me think of Leah. What did I have it here? I think it's in the end of chapter 29. Leah's talking and she says, it's because the Lord has looked upon my affliction. And I think one of the other things Genesis teaches us is that not only is that affliction normal, but the Lord has also looked upon us in the midst of that affliction. It's not lost on him, and he's present and comforting, and just like in Leah's life is working.
Yeah, we see him so active throughout the whole book. He's the one who's opening wombs. He's the one who's rescuing people from danger. He's the one repeating the blessing, appearing in dreams, giving instruction. He's really present and active in the lives of these people. And it's an important reminder to us that hasn't gone away. He's still just as active today.
Yeah, there's something to the fact that in all of Genesis, from the cosmic stuff down to the individual level of like Abram and his descendants, God always starts everything. It's never someone else starting something. No one ever comes to God and says, hey, why don't we try it this way? God's always first. He always beats you to redemption. He's always the first one there. And so by the time you realize something good is coming, he was always already initiating it. And you see it in every conceivable way, from creation to the promise that comes right after the fall, to God grabbing at some level, quote unquote, random person named Abram. Okay, you are going to go over here.
A pagan dude.
Yeah. I mean, just someone who, has shows up sheerly because God initiated something. And then you see him initiate with everyone else, all of his descendants. He's always keeping the promises that he decides to make. And that's just a really beautiful lesson that he does still do that today. We're children of the promises that God has made all along, that we didn't have to pry out of his hands. He made them himself, and then he kept them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hope, there's such a hope in this book because so many of God's people are so messed up. I mean, they're like straight bonkers at times. Like it doesn't make any sense, like what they're doing or why they're doing.
Even if you do know a bit about the culture, it still sometimes doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
It's like,
even within the culture, it's
weird.
weird. Yeah, it's still odd. There's just things that God's people do that are just so. Even the world does. There's things that Potiphar's wife does, and like the world around you, there's injustice on that side, but also amongst God's people, there's so much failure. There's like beautiful examples of faith, but so much failure. And you're like, oh, wow, God's been working with failing and struggling people forever. Great. Like I'm at the end of a long chain of failing and struggling people that God is being gracious towards. I think that's a hopeful thought for me as I read through some of these things. And I'm like, well, if someone read my life, they probably would think the same thing about certain things. If my life was written this way, they'd be like, why did you do that? What in the world? What kind of thing is that? And hopefully get the same kind of encouragement later on.
Yeah, we're going to see the same thing too, right? These are people who you're not supposed to read and go, okay, I should emulate them here and not emulate them there.
Right.
And that's like the takeaway.
Right.
The idea is that these are people God's working with to provide salvation and redemption to the nations and the world. And so he's going to get it done, and he's going to push things through, and these people are going to grow and participate in it. There's something beautiful to that. Okay, let's finish here. This is the book of Genesis, so we're at the very beginning, but all roads lead to Christ in Scripture. He's the center of all things. All things, come together in him and issue forth from him. How does the book of Genesis connect to Christ? Or at least what are some ways?
I was really struck by the character of Joseph. I know you mentioned him before, Scott, but the ways in which he also is betrayed by his own, that he is tested, he's tempted by Potiphar's wife, in the way that, Jesus also was tempted in the wilderness, and there's a lot of injustice against him. And yet he's a pretty honorable dude. He's not perfect. He's got some strange choices and flaws, but there are a lot of ways in which I think he is kind of this kind of mini version. And it really does make you think, like, okay, we know that a descendant of Eve is supposed to break the curse. Could it be him? Could it be him? And we conclude, of course, that he dies. So it's not him, but he seems like the closest we've gotten in the book so far.
Mm. Yeah, and I think in a real basic level, when I think to rewind back to the beginning, we see right after the fall, we have this promise, right? Mm-hmm. That God speaks, and he speaks to Satan, right? That he's going to put enmity between the man and him, and that he says he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. Basically, that you're going to try to reach out and strike the one to come, but he's going to crush your head. And we get that maybe a more specific promise in Abraham in chapter 17, where we see God promising Abraham that it's through him, through his descendants, that all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. And first of all, I feel like it makes me ask the question, well, how is that going to happen? Like, are they going to be like the rulers of the world? Like, how is one people, one family, no matter how numerous they get, how are all the nations of the world going to be blessed through one family? You're like, okay, I guess, but God can do it, And then you see how his family turns out, and you're like, well, no, really, how? Like how?
This isn't going so well.
This is not going so well, and it, and all along, like these are the seeds that lead us to we need something else. We need someone. We need a better Abraham, right? A better Noah, a better Joseph. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly. And so I think you see those echoes in this book so powerfully and so repeatedly.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many. That's the promise side, I think, is really compelling to me, and it's carried throughout the book and then throughout the rest of the Old Testament. There's this sort of narrowing focus of the promise of, it's going to be a descendant, this Messiah, this one who's going to crush the head of the serpent is going to be a descendant of Eve, and then is going to be a descendant of Abraham, going to be a descendant all the way on through, all the way down. We get to Judah and line of the tribe of Judah, and you get all these other places, right? You start following, and then the other messianic prophecies that come later. It's such a compelling thought. I think probably the thing that is the strongest echo for me, apart from the promise, apart from like the individual typology of certain characters, which I think is really compelling, is the Mount Moriah story. I mean, there's just something so compelling about, even after Ishmael's born, like it's, he's your son, your only son, right? It's like there's this sense of this the wood on his back being carried. I mean, there's this like picture of going out, and there's this profound, I think, foreshadowing of a sacrifice and the need for sacrifice of the pain and the visceral pain of killing your only son. The confusion and the anger and the frustration and the, like, as you're reading the story, just like the pain of all of it. And then stop taking a step back, realizing that this is, thousands of years before Jesus is born, and to see that God's son, God's only son, walked the same path and wasn't rescued by a ram at the last moment, but actually died. And you start seeing, oh wow, this whole story. The individual components of this story are so beautifully wrapped up into the big story in a cohesive way that is just extremely compelling and draws me to worship.
Yeah, I think as much as what we're doing in this cohort is doing the overview, to get a sense of the whole story, as you read, you're going to find little details that are sort of radioactive to you. They jump out. And that's always one for me is on
radioactive in a good way?
In a positive way. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. They sort of light up, like Christmas lights. That's positive. I don't know. They glow. And for me, one of them is in the Mount Moriah story, when that mountain's named, the Lord will provide, because there's a ram there, and the ram is caught in this thicket. And if you're picturing things as you read, not everyone does that the same way, but if you're picturing a ram caught in a thicket, and that's what's going to get sacrificed, you realize, and it's caught by the head, you realize that there's a ram with a crown of thorns that's about to get sacrificed. And you go, I was what I'm saying. Well, I mean, there were people, in the old days, they just catch these everywhere. But to me, that becomes this detail.
Yes.
That isn't a distraction. It's not this like really cool little deep thing that someone saw. It's like, it's a picture of the whole. That's a picture of what's happening. And it shows you that all the way back in Genesis, we are telling the story of Jesus, not just in like echoes and allusions, but in preparation. We're walking towards Jesus, even all the way back here. And God has written that kind of foreshadowing into history so that no matter where we go in Scripture, we can see him and find him and worship him. And there's a beauty to that part of the Bible cohort is seeing that too, is seeing Christ in all of Scripture. So a mad dash through the book of Genesis, obviously so much more to talk about. But, for those of you listening, we just began an overview of the story of God. And we're doing that not just so we can be familiar with it, but so that we can know that we live in it too. The story of God is our story. So in a sense, if you're a Christian, you're looking at your own history here, and this belongs to you. It's something you should know and savor and enjoy. And hopefully our discussion here is a way of helping you savor and enjoy the book of Genesis. And there's more to come. So we look forward to talking to you next time.